Hello again. The sound of gunfire rang through the Sudanese capital Khartoum today, marking the end of a 24-hour ceasefire. This as fighting between the army and its rival, the Rapid Support Forces, is raging since the first outbreak in April. Africa-Asia Dialogue Senior Research Fellow Thembisa Fakude joins us now for more on this. A very good evening to you, sir. Grateful for your time. So why is it that no truce ever seems to hold in Sudan from that very first sign or hope that the fighting would come to an end in April?
Well, it baffles all of us on why this is not. I mean, this is, I think, the fifth truce that was negotiated by the Americans and the Saudis between the RSF and SAF. And we're still seeing them time and again breaking the truce. And the people who are suffering at the moment are the Sudanese people. So it's quite a dire situation of Sudanese. And you heard what happened yesterday when Egyptians has asked or now require that all the Sudanese who cross the border into Egypt must have a visa. Of course, notwithstanding that nothing works in Sudan, but the Sudanese somehow, I mean, the Egyptians, they've somehow decided that the Sudanese who are fleeing the conflict in Khartoum and other parts of Sudan require a visa to enter into Egypt.
And how might that develop, I wonder, the regional impact of this, basically what has morphed into a civil war at this stage, because you've got the likes of Egypt now saying they need stricter controls on Sudanese people who are trying to cross into the country. You've got a humanitarian crisis unfolding in Chad, where tens of thousands of Sudanese have arrived since fighting broke out, and the region is not the wealthiest and will not be able to cope.
Oh yeah, there's going to be very difficult times ahead, particularly in countries such as Chad, which borders Darfur. That's where the conflict is taking place, and we know that in there we've got the Wagner group, the Russians, who are also facilitating or helping the RSF to fight the Sudanese army. So it's quite a difficult situation for the neighbors of Sudan and Egypt. Of course, there's been thousands of people have since crossed into Egypt. So this is turning out to be a regional disaster. So we'll have to wait and see what will happen. But the negotiations that are taking place at the moment are not yielding any results. The Americans and the Egyptians and the Saudis don't seem to be making headway. The countries that were delegated by the AU as well, they've since lost steam in terms of negotiations. So it's quite a serious situation. We'll have to see what will happen when the negotiations resume again tomorrow.
And why aren't the mediating or countries hosting these talks, why aren't they making headway? Because Saudi Arabia and the United States have been meeting for weeks on end, in fact, with the two sides in Jeddah, yet all they've been able to produce to date are these temporary ceasefires.
Well, there are a number of reasons, and one of the reasons which has led to this stalemate is that the stakeholders, the main stakeholders, are not involved in these negotiations, or at least they're not publicly involved. We don't know about them getting involved, and that is the United Arab Emirates and Russia, because Russia is involved, particularly in Darfur. They've got some mining concessions there and then mining business together with the RSF. So Russia is part and parcel of this, and we also know that the Emiratis are also involved in this conflict. But notwithstanding that those two major players in Sudan are involved, we don't see their presence at the negotiation table at the moment. We only see the Egyptians, Saudis, and the Americans.
Would they be able to make better progress than the Americans, than the Saudis and the Egyptians in trying to bring about lasting peace at this stage?
Well, I think so, because they are the financial sponsors, particularly Emiratis. I think what you need at the moment is to hit these two parties where it hit most, and which is their pockets. But as long as it's business as usual and they continue getting the assistance, particularly financial assistance, it's going to continue finding ourselves in this kind of situation, particularly the RSF that is making a lot of money with the assistance of the Wagner group in Darfur. So until those two players, at least from where I sit, get involved and they are forced to put pressure on both parties who are involved in this conflict to adhere at least to ceasefires, we are still going to be seeing the conflict continuing in Sudan.
And history tells us that war is and has been a very lucrative business Who ultimately benefits from instability in Sudan specifically?
Well, in Sudan specifically, those who benefit ultimately will be the arms manufacturers. It's the Wagner Group and indirectly Russia, because Russia is involved with the Wagner Group in the mining business in Darfur. So those are the two main players that will benefit, and particularly, those who manufacture these weapons of destruction are likely to benefit. But you also have the strategic, foreigners or foreign countries that are looking at exploiting and taking advantage of a Sudan that's not properly functioning, because Sudan, as you know, shares a very wide coastline, and the more you have a disruption in Sudan and Somalia, chances are, the taxes and all levies that's supposed to be going to these countries are not going to be going to those countries. That's the first point. The other point is also Sudan imports and exports oil from South Sudan particularly. So if that is disrupted, you are likely again to see the emergence of the black market, which is currently benefiting again in Sudan. So those are the stakeholders and the players that are likely to benefit, but particularly it's the Wagner Group that is likely to particularly and indirectly the Russians.
How valid is the criticism that the African continent has not paid enough attention to the situation in Sudan, and people have taken that and compared it to the upcoming trip by heads of state from the continent who are now going to try and go on a peace mission and try to end fighting between Russia and Ukraine? Is that a fair comparison?
It is a fair comparison, but there's history to it. There's history to the apparent ignoring of what's happening in Sudan. Number one, Sudan regards itself as an Arab state. So they are more keen or engaged with the Arab League, for example. The African Union has been trying, if notwithstanding, of course, that Sudan is part of the Arab Union. But the Sudanese see themselves, by and large, and that's why you have the petitioning, if you remember, of the South Sudan and Sudan proper. It was mainly because the Northerners see themselves as Arabs. So that's the first point. And the AU has not been given a chance. When the efforts by the AU were afoot, you also saw Egyptians and Americans taking advantage and entering the fray in terms of negotiation. So until we have the Sudanese themselves, changing their political compass into Africa, you are likely to see the role of Africans not as significant. So the criticism against Ramaphosa, I don't think it's fair. I think it's a bit misplaced. It's the Sudanese that we need to look at in terms of who do they take serious in negotiations, who do they take serious in global politics. And I'll argue that they see themselves much more to benefit if they look to the east, particularly towards the Arab League.
Thembisa Fakude, good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time tonight.